Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be tackling some of your notes, on JavaScript fundamentals.
Yeah, some of the basics.
Exactly the bedrock
That's a good way to put it.
of the language.
Yeah.
So these are the things that if you don't have a good grasp on, you're going to have a hard time moving forward with JavaScript.
For sure, for sure.
And a lot of people, we hear from you all the time. I'm really interested in JavaScript. I want to learn it, but it seems a little intimidating.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're going to try to do today is break down these concepts in a way that will make them understandable and applicable to your work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get right into it.
Let's do it.
We're talking about things like variables, data types, and operators. And again, those might sound a little technical, but honestly, they're just the basic building blocks for creating anything in JavaScript.
Yeah, you can think of it like if you're building a house.
Right.
These are the bricks and the mortar.
Yeah, like the foundation you can't.
Right, absolutely. You can't build a house without a strong foundation.
Yeah, and once you understand these concepts, you can start seeing the logic behind everything from, simple website interactions.
To like a full-blown web application.
To a huge web application.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So let's start with variables.
Yeah.
What are those all about?
So a variable is like a container that you
Right.
can put information in.
Okay.
So it could be a number, it could be some text.
Okay.
It can even be something more complex.
So if I wanted to store someone's name, I would create a variable for that.
Yeah, exactly. So you'd give it a name,
Okay.
like a username or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would put the person's name in that variable.
And in JavaScript, we create those containers using certain keywords.
Yeah, there are a few different keywords you can use. The most common are let const, and sometimes you'll see var.
Okay. Now, I remember from my notes that var is
Var's a little bit old school.
a little old school.
Yeah.
Okay. So why is that?
Well, it still works. It's
Yeah.
kind of like the vintage record player of JavaScript.
Okay.
But let and const, these were introduced in a more recent version of JavaScript called ES6.
Okay.
And they offer a little bit more control.
Okay.
And they generally make your code a little more predictable.
Okay. So they're basically like the upgrade
They're the upgrade.
from var.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between let and const then?
So let is for values that might change.
Okay.
So for example, if you're writing code for a game,
Yeah.
you might use let to store the player's score.
Okay.
Because that's going to change throughout the game.
Makes sense.
Const, on the other hand, is for values that are never going to change.
Okay.
Like the mathematical constant pi.
Okay.
That never changes. So you would use const for that.
So if I was coding a game, I'd use let to keep track of the score because you could go up or down.
Exactly.
But if I was, doing some math formula that used pi,
Right.
I'd use const because that would never change. And that makes it clear to anybody reading the code that, hey,
Yeah.
this is something that's not going to change.
Right. It's like putting a little sign on it that says, do not touch.
Right, exactly.
This is a fixed value.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Now, you mentioned something a moment ago about scope.
Yeah.
What is that all about?
Yeah. Scope is a really important concept in programming.
Okay.
It refers to where a variable can be accessed in your code.
Okay.
So let and const have what's called block scope,
Okay.
which means that they're only accessible within the specific block of code
Yeah.
that they're defined in.
Okay, so they're kind of
It's like having a private room.
in their own little bubble.
Yeah, exactly. So only the people who are allowed in that room
Uh-huh.
can access those variables.
So that helps prevent like mix-ups if you accidentally use the same variable name
Exactly.
in different parts of your code.
Yeah, it helps keep things tidy and organized,
Right.
and it prevents accidental conflicts.
So you don't overwrite something accidentally.
Ex-
Okay, that makes sense. Now we've talked about these containers, these variables.
Right.
What kind of information can we actually put inside of them?
Yeah.
I think that's where data types come in.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So data types tell JavaScript what kind of value is stored in a variable.
Okay.
So you got your basic types like numbers,
Okay.
strings, which are just text,
Uh-huh.
and booleans, which are true or false values.
Gotcha. Okay, so those are kind of like the basic ingredients in a recipe.
Exactly, you got it.
Like I might have flour, sugar, and eggs.
Yeah.
And those are all different types of ingredients.
And you can combine those in different ways to create all sorts of different dishes.
Right.
Same thing with data types in JavaScript. You can combine them in different ways to create more complex data structures.
Okay.
And that brings us to the more complex data types like objects and arrays.
Okay, so we have like the simple values, like just a number.
Right.
But then we can have variables that hold much more complex information, like a whole object.
Exactly, like a whole recipe book, instead of just a single ingredient.
Gotcha. Now, one thing that I remember kind of tripping me up when I was first learning JavaScript was this idea of dynamic typing.
Ah, yes.
Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so dynamic typing means that you don't have to explicitly tell JavaScript what type of data a variable is going to hold.
Okay.
It figures it out as the code runs.
Okay. And so what is that? Is that good? Is that bad?
Well, it can be both.
Okay.
It's definitely convenient
Yeah.
because it saves you some typing,
Uh-huh.
but it can also lead to some quirks
Okay.
if you're not careful.
So like what kind of quirks are we talking about?
Well, for example, JavaScript might automatically convert between data types,
Mm-hmm.
and the results aren't always what you'd expect.
Okay, so it's powerful,
Yes,
but comes with some things to watch out for.
exactly. You have to be aware of the potential pitfalls.
Right, so being aware of those nuances is key to writing good code. All right, so we've got our variables. We know what types of data they can hold, but how do we actually work with that data? Like, how do we do calculations or compare values?
That's where operators come in.
Okay,
Operators are the symbols that let you perform actions on your data.
okay.
So if you want to add two numbers together, you would use the plus operator.
So, like, if I have two variables,
Yeah.
one is called, like, number 1 and one's called number 2,
Yeah,
I can just do number 1 plus number 2.
exactly. And that will give you the sum of those two numbers.
Okay, so we're talking about things like plus, minus, multiplication, division, greater than, less, and all that good
All
stuff.
that good stuff, yeah.
Are there any other types of operators that we should be aware of?
Oh, yeah. There are tons of different operators in JavaScript.
Okay.
You've got operators for assigning values to variables,
Right.
operators for comparing values, and even operators for combining conditions using what are called logical operators like AND and OR.
Okay, now when we're talking about comparing values, I remember seeing something about like strict comparison versus loose comparison.
Ah, yes, that's an important distinction.
Okay, can you explain that?
So in JavaScript, there are two ways to compare values.
Okay.
You can use the double equal sign, which is loose comparison,
Okay.
or you can use the triple equal sign, which is strict comparison.
And what's the difference?
So strict comparison checks both the value and the type of the data,
Okay.
while loose comparison only checks the value.
And that can lead to some unexpected results.
Exactly, because JavaScript will sometimes automatically convert between data types
Right.
to try to make the comparison work.
So if I'm comparing, the number 5
Yeah,
to the string 5,
right.
loose comparison might say those are equal.
Yeah, it might try to convert the string 5 to the number 5
Gotcha.
and then say, yeah, they're equal.
But strict comparison would say, no, these are different because one is a number and one is a string.
Exactly. So strict comparison is generally safer
Okay.
because it helps you avoid those unexpected results.
So triple equals is like a safety check to make sure we're comparing
You could say
apples to apples.
Yeah.
Gotcha. All right. I'm starting to see how all of this fits together.
Yeah.
We've got our variables holding different kinds of data,
Right.
and we can use operators to manipulate that data.
Exactly.
What else is crucial to understanding these fundamentals?
I think a good place to start would be understanding how these pieces work together in real code.
Right. It's one thing to know, like, the definitions,
Right.
but seeing how it all plays out in practice
Yeah.
is really where the learning happens.
Absolutely.
So maybe we should look at an example
Yeah, let's do that.
of how this all comes together.
Okay, so I remember in your notes.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about wanting to build a simple interactive feature for a website.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking about something like a guess the number game.
Perfect.
Just something simple
Yeah, that's a great example.
to start out with.
So let's break down how we could build that using the fundamentals we've discussed so far.
Okay. Sounds good.
First, we need a way to store the secret number that the user has to guess.
Okay.
So we can use a const variable for that, since it shouldn't change during the game.
So like const secret number equals 7.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Now we need to get the user's guess,
Mhm.
and we can use a built-in function in JavaScript called prompt,
Okay.
which will pop up a little window
Right.
where they can type in their guess.
Gotcha. And so whatever they type in is going to be treated as a string, even if it's a number.
That's right.
Okay.
So we need to convert that string to a number.
Okay.
And we can do that using another built-in function called number.
Okay.
So we can store their guess in a variable called userGuess.
Okay.
And the code would look something like this. Let userGuess equals number, open parentheses, prompt, open parentheses, guess, a number between 1 and 10, close parentheses. close parentheses.
Okay.
So that line of code is going to do a few things. It's going to first show the prompt
Okay.
asking the user to guess a number.
Uh-huh.
Then it's going to take whatever they type in and convert it to a number.
Okay.
And finally, it's going to store that number in the user guess variable.
Awesome.
Now comes the fun part.
Okay.
Comparing their guess to the secret number.
Right.
And we can use an if statement for that.
If statement.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if the user guess is equal to the secret number, they win.
Okay.
And if it's not, we can give them a hint. So we can use an else-if statement to check if their guess is too high or too low.
So this is where those comparison operators come in.
Exactly.
Like greater than or less than.
Yeah.
To actually check if their guess is higher or lower.
Exactly. And we can use those to give the user feedback and guide them towards the correct answer.
It's like we're building a little decision-making tree.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
And all of this is built on those core concepts that we've been talking about. Variables to store the data operators, to compare and manipulate the data, and conditional statements to control the flow of the game.
Yeah, I'm realizing that coding is all about breaking down a problem into these logical steps.
Absolutely. It's all about logic.
Now, speaking of those fundamentals, are there any best practices or common pitfalls that we should keep in mind, especially when it comes to variables?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because this is something that trips up a lot of beginners.
Okay.
So one of the most common mistakes is forgetting to declare a variable before you use it.
Okay, so if I just start using a variable name without actually saying like let.
Yeah, without using let, const, or var.
JavaScript's going to get mad.
JavaScript's going to throw an error and say, hey, I don't know what this is.
Right.
So always make sure you declare your variables.
Okay, good tip.
Another common pitfall is accidentally reassigning a const variable.
Oh, right.
So remember, const is for constant values.
Right.
They're not supposed to change.
So if I create a const and then I try to later change it.
Yeah, if you try to reassign it, JavaScript's going to throw an error.
Gotcha. So it's like a safety feature.
Exactly. It's there to protect you.
To prevent me from shooting myself in the foot.
Exactly.
Okay. Any other best practices that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so we talked about how var is a little bit outdated.
Right.
But is there ever a time when using var might be okay?
I mean, I would imagine if I'm looking at somebody else's code and they use var, I should probably know what it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
But should I ever be using var?
So it's true that let and const are generally preferred in modern JavaScript.
Okay.
But you might still encounter var in older code.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And one key difference between them lies in how they handle scope.
Scope. Okay, so can you just remind us quickly what scope is all about?
Yeah, so scope refers to where a variable can be accessed in your code. And let and const have what's called block scope, which means they're only accessible within the specific block of code that they're defined in.
So like if they're inside of a function,
exactly,
they can only be used inside of that function.
Right. It's like having a private room where only people with access can enter.
Right.
var, on the other hand, has what's called function scope. Which means it's accessible throughout the entire function.
Even if it's declared.
Yeah, even if it's declared inside of a block of code.
Inside of a block within that function.
Exactly. So it has a wider scope.
Okay, so using let and const whenever possible basically helps to keep things more contained.
Exactly.
More organized.
It makes your code more predictable and easier to manage.
Okay, so they're like the building codes.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Of your program.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want your house falling down because you didn't follow the building codes.
Right.
So let and const are the building codes of your JavaScript program.
I like that.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about variables and data types and operators.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would consider absolutely essential?
Yeah. There's one more thing that we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah.
That's the concept of expressions and statements.
Okay.
Which are fundamental.
Yeah, I remember seeing those terms in my notes.
To how JavaScript code is structured and executed.
So break those down for us.
Okay, so an expression is a piece of code that produces a value.
Right.
So it can be as simple as a single number.
Okay.
Like the number 5. Or it can be as complex as a combination of variables, operators, and function calls.
Okay.
But the key thing is it produces a value.
So something like 2 plus 2
exactly
is an expression because it evaluates to 4.
Exactly.
And if I have a variable called userage, and I say userage greater than or equal to 18, That's also an expression.
That's also an expression because it evaluates to either true or false.
Gotcha. Okay, so expressions produce values.
Yes.
What about statements?
So a statement is a complete instruction that performs an action.
Okay.
So it tells JavaScript to do something.
So like what's an example of a statement?
So for example, a variable declaration.
Yeah.
Like let score equals 0.
Okay.
That's a statement because it's telling JavaScript to create a variable called score and set its value to 0.
And what about like the if statements?
If statements are also statements because they're telling JavaScript
to do something.
To do something based on a certain condition.
So the main difference is that an expression produces a value.
Yes.
And a statement performs an action.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And you'll see that expressions can actually be parts of statements.
Okay.
And statements often rely on expressions to make decisions or perform calculations.
So like in that if statement that we were talking about earlier, you know, if the user guess is greater than the secret number.
That comparison right there, that user guess greater than secret number.
Yeah. That's an expression.
That's an expression.
That's producing a true or false value.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So expressions and statements kind of work together.
They work together, yeah.
They're like two sides of the same coin.
I like that, yeah.
So knowing about these two things, how does that help us as we're continuing to learn JavaScript?
So understanding this distinction is really crucial because it helps you break down your code into smaller logical units, which makes it much easier to read and understand.
Makes sense.
And it also makes it easier to debug.
Oh, okay. So when you're trying to figure out
when things go wrong,
what's going wrong with your code, you can break it down.
Much easier to pinpoint the problem
into these expressions and statements.
Exactly.
It's easier to find where the problem is.
Yeah, it's like organizing a messy room.
Right.
When everything has its place, it's much easier to find what you need. Yeah, I was thinking about it. Like, you know, if you're trying to bake a cake and you just dump all the ingredients into a bowl.
Right.
At the same time.
It's going to be a mess.
It's not going to turn out very well.
Yeah.
So we need to, you know, follow the steps, mix the ingredients in the right order.
Exactly.
The right tools.
It's all about having a clear structure.
Yeah.
And understanding the different parts.
So true. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to stop for today.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've explored variables and data types.
Yeah.
Operators, expressions, statements.
All the building blocks.
Yeah, all those foundational elements.
Of JavaScript.
Yeah. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners as they continue their JavaScript journey?
The most important thing is to practice consistently.
Yes. Practice, practice, practice.
The more you code, the more these concepts really solidify in your mind.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to experiment, make mistakes, and learn from them.
Yeah. That's great advice. It's easy to get overwhelmed when you're first starting out.
Yeah.
But remembering that everyone starts somewhere is crucial.
Absolutely. Embrace the learning process. Be patient with yourself.
Yeah.
And most importantly, have fun.
Have fun.
Along the way.
That's the most important part.
It is.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
For this deep dive into JavaScript fundamentals.
Until next time.
We'll see you next time.
Happy coding.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. I think a good place to start would be understanding how all these pieces work together in real code.
Right. It's one thing to know, like, the definitions.
Right.
But seeing how it all plays out in practice is really where the learning happens.
Absolutely.
So maybe we should look at an example.
Yeah, let's do that.
Of how this all comes together.
Okay, so I remember in your notes, you mentioned something about wanting to build a simple interactive feature for a website.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking about something like a guess the number game. You know, just something simple.
Yeah, that's a great example
to start out with.
So let's break down how we could build that using the fundamentals we've discussed so far.
Okay, sounds good.
First, we need a way to store the secret number that the user has to guess.
Okay.
So we can use a const variable for that, since it shouldn't change during the game.
So like const secret number equals 7.
Exactly. Okay. Now we need to get the user's guess. And we can use a built-in function in JavaScript called prompt, which will pop up a little window where they can type in their guess.
Gotcha. And so whatever they type in is going to be treated as a string, even if it's a number.
That's right.
Okay.
So we need to convert that string to a number.
Okay.
And we can do that using another built-in function called number.
Okay.
So we can store their guess in a variable called userGuess. And the code would look something like this. Let userGuess equals number. open parentheses, prompt, open parentheses, guess a number between 1 and 10, close parentheses.
Okay.
So that line of code is going to do a few things.
Right.
It's going to first show the prompt,
Okay.
asking the user to guess a number.
Uh-huh.
Then it's going to take whatever they type in and convert it to a number.
Okay.
And finally, it's going to store that number in the user guess variable.
Awesome.
Now comes the fun part.
Okay.
Comparing their guess to the secret number.
Right.
And we can use an if statement for that.
If statement.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if the user guess is equal to the secret number, they win.
Okay.
And if it's not, we can give them a hint. So we can use an else if statement to check if their guess is too high or too low.
So this is where those comparison operators come in.
Exactly.
Like greater than or less than.
Yeah.
To actually check
right.
if their guess is higher or lower.
Exactly. And we can use those to give the user feedback.
And guide them towards the correct answer.
It's like we're building a little decision-making tree.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
And all of this is built on those core concepts that we've been talking about.
Right.
Variables to store the data operators, to compare and manipulate the data, and conditional statements to control the flow of the game.
Yeah, I'm realizing that coding is all about breaking down a problem into these logical steps.
Absolutely. It's all about logic.
Now, speaking of those fundamentals, are there any best practices or common pitfalls that we should keep in mind, especially when it comes to variables?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because this is something that trips up a lot of beginners.
Okay.
Yeah. One more thing we haven't talked about yet is expressions and statements.
Okay.
And these are fundamental to how JavaScript code is structured.
Yeah, I remember seeing those terms in my notes.
Yeah.
But I'm a little fuzzy on what exactly they are.
Okay, so an expression is basically a piece of code that produces a value.
So it can be something as simple as a single number, like the number 5, or it can be a really complex combination of variables and operators and even function calls.
Yeah.
But the key is it produces a value when JavaScript executes it.
Okay, so something like 2 plus 2.
Exactly. 2 plus 2 is an expression because it produces the value 4.
Gotcha. And like earlier we were talking about if the user's age is greater than or equal to 18.
Yeah, that's an expression too.
That's an expression too because it produces either true or false.
Exactly. It evaluates to true or false.
So expressions produce values. What about statements?
A statement is a complete instruction that tells JavaScript to do something.
Okay.
It performs an action.
Give me an example of a statement.
So a variable declaration like let score equals 0, that's a statement because it's telling JavaScript, hey, create a variable called score and give it an initial value of 0.
Okay. And what about if statements?
If statements are also statements because they tell JavaScript to do something based on a condition.
So the main difference is an expression produces a value. A statement tells JavaScript to perform an action.
You got it.
All right. So expressions produce values. Statements perform actions.
Yeah, and you'll notice that expressions can be part of statements. And statements often rely on expressions to make decisions or perform calculations.
So like in that if statement example,
exactly.
If the user guess is greater than the secret number.
Right, that right there, the user guess greater than secret number, that's an expression.
Okay, so that whole thing is an expression.
It is.
And it's evaluated to true or false.
Right.
And then based on that, the if statement decides what to do.
That's how it works.
Okay, cool. So expressions and statements work together.
They do. They're like two sides of the same coin.
I like that.
Yeah.
So why is it so important to know about expressions and statements?
Well, as your JavaScript code gets more complex, understanding this difference is going to be super helpful.
Okay.
Because it lets you break your code down into smaller logical units.
Okay.
Which makes it easier to read and understand.
And easier to debug.
And easier to debug when things inevitably go wrong.
Right. Because if we can isolate these little pieces.
Right. If you can isolate the expressions and the statements, it's much easier to pinpoint the problem.
It's like if you're trying to bake a cake and you just dump all the ingredients in a bowl at the same time.
It's going to be a disaster.
It's going to be a mess. So we need to follow the recipe.
Right. We need to follow the steps.
Mix the ingredients in the right order.
Yeah.
Use the right tools.
Exactly. It's all about structure and understanding the different parts.
So true. All right. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've talked about variables, data types, operators,
expressions,
statements,
all that good stuff.
The foundational elements of JavaScript.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but hopefully we've broken it down
Hopefully.
in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
Any parting words of wisdom for our listeners?
The best advice I can give is just keep practicing.
Practice, practice, practice.
The more you code, the more all of this is going to sink in.
Right. And don't be afraid to experiment. make mistakes.
Exactly.
You're going to learn from your mistakes. That's the best way to learn.
That's how we all learn.
Absolutely.
So embrace that.
And remember that everybody starts somewhere.
Absolutely. We were all beginners once.
Yeah. So just be patient with yourself.
And have fun.
Most importantly, have fun.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into JavaScript fundamentals.
Yeah.
Until next time, happy coding.
Happy coding.